This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on globalization. At the end of the Cold War, globalization's foundations began to be set. The United States and the USSR had been ideological competitors along with third world nations. But now, after the Cold War, the United States was what was called a unipolar power with dominant military, economic, and cultural centers. By unipolar, what I mean is that there was no longer a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, but the US now had dominance around the world. However, there were major new problems coming up over the horizon. For one, there were environmental questions on issues like global warming, the spread of disease, and the development of third world countries. There was also international immigration patterns and the reach of drug cartels that would oftentimes follow on this international immigration. And with the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons began to proliferate, and securing these materials became very difficult since they were now loose from the USSR. In developing countries, there were nationalist movements. When the USSR broke up, there were nationalist movements in a place south of the USSR called Chechnya. Also, Yugoslavia broke up into three countries: Bosnia, Serbia, and Montenegro. Serbia was led by Slobodan Milosevic, who led a genocidal campaign to purify Serbia of all Bosnians. In Rwanda, there was a long-standing ethnic dispute between Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus led a massacre against the Tutsis because the Tutsis had once been allies to the Dutch, who had colonized Rwanda in the 1950s and 1960s. There was a general economic view about what would happen during the period of globalization called neoliberalism. Neoliberals believe in the freedom of economic markets. They believe that an international economy will run best when governments lower tariffs and allow for trade between countries. This trade goes across borders and includes both trade and services. They believe that this will increase innovation, competition, and the production of goods, and therefore the general good of all people around the world. As trade increased, so did international immigration. The increase in production of goods and services led to a demand for more labor. Some of this demand has been fulfilled through finding cheap labor in places like Southeastern Asian countries. But also migrant workers have moved from the third world or developing world into first world countries looking for work. This often has led to ethnic conflict, such as in Europe between Muslim and European workers. And it has led to conflict in Northern America between citizens and what is known as illegal labor. In all these cases, the pattern has been a movement of labor from nearby developing countries or third world countries to first world countries, resulting in ethnic conflict. International markets have been sparked by the development of multinational companies. Multinational companies provide investment and development to the third world. But they also look for cheap labor sources and often affect government policy on taxation and regulations. The way they do this is multinational companies go to different countries and demand that they have lower taxes and lower regulations. They promise then to provide jobs to the people, but they are going to these countries to keep their labor costs down, so the jobs they provide usually are paid at a very low rate. The governments then have to compete by lowering their standards on pollution, taxation, and labor costs. Internationally, the world has two major institutions that have tried to spur on this growth of economics. One of them is the International Monetary Fund, which provides the rules for loans to governments for development. These rules are based upon the idea that they must lower the value of their currency to fight inflation. The problem with this is that the government is not providing support for the workers and the unemployed. Over time, internationally, there have been a number of organizations established to try to lower tariffs. One of these is the World Trade Organization, which was created in the 1990s for major nations in order to lower tariffs and increase international trade. In 1999, major protests broke out in Seattle about the WTO. They claimed that multinationals were manipulating cheap labor, multinationals were using the third world to dump their pollution, and multinationals took away government sovereignty to make laws for their countries because multinationals were not based in these countries and would use the countries to compete amongst them. Of course, another huge problem that arose in the 1990s and 2000s due to globalization was the rise of a new form of terrorism. Terrorism has existed for several centuries, but this new form of terrorism crossed over national boundaries, and most of the cells of these terrorist groups were not really located in any one nationality. Of course, the most famous of these is Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, also known as the Base, which initially was fighting against the USSR in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden's goal was to create what was called a new caliphate, or a Muslim kingdom which would stretch from northern Africa to southeastern Asia. His major complaints was that the U.S. troops had been occupied in the Holy Lands, especially Saudi Arabia. Also, he complained that the U.S. supported Israel, and he complained that the U.S. supported authoritarian regimes in the Middle East for access to oil. Of course, one of the biggest problems that has come out at the time of globalization is the theory of global warming. The theory of global warming is based upon the idea that development of industry leads to CO2, and this carbon dioxide traps heat and intensifies it in the earth, causing increases in global temperatures over time. The development in India and China has been dramatically successful in the last 3 decades as far as industrialization goes. In fact, India is about to outpace China in population growth. But this means more cars, meat production, and energy production in 2 of the world's greatest population centers. This means that the effects overall of global warming can be much more hazardous. Glaciers have been melting at an incredibly rising rate. Sea levels have been rising on a regular basis over the last 30 to 40 years. Cloud cover has been increasing, giving the idea that we're actually cooling, but actually cloud cover increases because of the overall evaporation of oceans, which means we're heating up. Deserts are growing. And so the overall argument is that an increase in carbon dioxide production leads to a cover that traps sunlight in the Earth's atmosphere, leading to a higher average long-term temperatures and a rate of temperatures going up.